Hello. This is the complexitist position on human rights, or just rights in general. So it could include things like animal rights, as well as rights outside of necessarily human consideration. Rights are a tricky political thing because they're the cause of much upset and uproar, and they're the cause of much upset and theater on the internet currently, and I usually avoid talking about them. The one time I talked about them, I made a video titled "Why We Don't Need Rights," and it got some upvotes and a bunch of downvotes. It's funny because by any test, any political test, or any survey, if you were to ask me my opinion on what is right and wrong, most of the time I would probably say that I am in agreement with, I guess, the colloquial notion of rights. Like, say, for example, should this whole certain things that happen on Twitter and people getting banned and so on, am I for that? I would say no, and I would say the same thing that the people who are for rights would say, basically. However, it's for a totally different reason, and I think the reason is really important, and I just find it funny because it's always misinterpreted, and I think it's partially because of how sensitive a topic rights actually are. So this is the complexitist idea of rights, or how rights fit into the model of complexitism. And so I'm just going to lay out the thing in a bit. Rights are, in practice, they're just saying that a person can do what they want. They can do what they want within some sort of parameter. It's very loose. It's very ambiguous. It's not really that well defined. It honestly depends. Like things like property rights and stuff. They're not exactly rigorous philosophical concepts. At most, they're rigorous legal concepts, and that's about it. But there's an implicit sort of subjectivist model within any type of rights-based philosophy, which suggests that a person who has certain rights can do whatever they want with those rights, and it's there can be no like external evaluation of the ethic. There can be no moral value to anything that they do, so long as they are within their rights. If a person does something within their rights, that's not good, it's not bad, it's nothing. It's always it's always good because it's within their rights. There can be no moral discussion of something that is within a person's rights. In other words, this sort of entails some kind of it entails one of two things. It entails either some sort of subjective relative moral setting, or it suggests an absolute moral setting where the only time anything can ever be bad is if rights are being violated. Now, complexitism, which I sort of putting forward in my other video, but to explain, like, complexitism does assume, well, it doesn't assume, its core, some of its core aspects entail positive consequentialism and moral absolutism. Complexitism posits that there is an absolute moral reference frame. And within this absolute moral reference frame, you have an absolute moral function, or a universal moral function, that takes any number of inputs and gives you an output of good or bad. And this moral function, it applies to every single thing that a person does and can do. So, from that perspective, everything can and is good or bad, whether it's within a person's rights or not. And basically, it violates the concept of rights at a fundamental level, in that it suggests that good and bad still applies even when a person is within their rights, right? In fact, it's even stronger than that. What it says is that good and bad is more important than the rights themselves. So it's actually, in a way, this absolute moral reference frame. It's sort of it's something one could accuse of being like a totalitarian or a very authoritarian framing. And my retort to that would be that it's not. It's an inevitable aspect of all ethical systems, so you can't really criticize it for being totalitarian. Basically, yeah, I'm a moral absolutist. I think there's an absolute moral setting, and I think it's obvious that there's an absolute moral reference frame by virtue of the fact that any way that you try to justify any ethical system, you have to justify it on some sort of absolute moral. There has to be some sort of like, there has to be a reason for it that's like absolutely good. Like there's some certain leftists will argue about like moral relativism, be like moral relativism is important, and moral relativism is good, or they'll act like moral relativism is true. Moral relativism is clearly true. But then if you try to probe them on it and you try to really get down to the, the fundament, the bedrock of that concept, and you'll see that like, moral relativism actually assumes a meta-ethical, an absolute reference frame on the level of meta-ethics, because it assumes that moral relativism is better than moral irrelativism, or moral absolutism. So it just by assuming that, it is meta-ethically absolutist, because it's saying moral absolutism bad, moral relativism good. No matter what you do, you always run into that type of absolutist problem. You always have to justify something on the basis of it being simply, absolutely, objectively better. So, moral absolutism applies in that sense, and it's the same thing with like self-interest versus social interest. Like self-interest is something that, if it were to be gauged accurately, it's inherited from social interest, and social interest, if it were to be gauged accurately, is inherited from the absolute moral function. And so what is in your self-interest is actually whatever the absolute moral function tells you. Anything else is not actually in your self-interest. It's the same type of logic, right? So how does this apply to rights? Well, the way it applies to rights is basically rights are just seen as a means to an end. And I've said this before, and for some reason people just don't like that idea. I've tried having this discussion with people. They don't like, they either don't understand. I mean, they definitely don't understand, but in some ways they think that there's some sort of threat when I try to suggest that rights are only mean anything insofar as they are a strategy, not an end in and of themselves. But that's pretty much the idea. The rights are not an end in and of themselves. That's the complexitist perspective. They can't be the end in and of themselves, because the end is to establish complexity maximization and maximize complexity. Now what that means is, if I think someone's rights, which are purely a legal thing as well, shouldn't be violated, it's not because there is some inherent moral truth or value in having rights, or that I think that it's some great injustice is being done. It's because I don't believe that doing so will lead to complexity maximizing, things happening. So for example, people getting banned from Twitter and so on. It's like, is it bad because they, no matter who they are, they deserve to say whatever? No, it's bad because I don't, regardless of why they're banned, them being banned isn't taking away the thing that's causing them to do the banning, if you know what I mean. It's like a thing. It's like, if someone's an asshole, I'm not gonna want to silence them. They can still. I want them to say, what they want, because more so I'm more concerned with trying to expose them. Trying to expose the actual perspective that they have, and not sort of try to hide it within some kind of superficial like, yeah, everything's fine. That person's not allowed to say that. I think exposing it is better, but that's still a strategy. In terms of ethics, no, I don't agree with this. I don't agree with the fact that this person is an asshole. I ethically don't agree with that, right? So it's like, just because I'm for them having the ability to say that, or having them, make it impossible for the legal system to persecute them for saying something, that doesn't mean that I'm ethically on board with what they're doing. It's really important to make that distinction, I think. As people think it's not. It's like, no, are you for rights? That's the only thing that matters. No, that's not what matters. What matters is what they actually do. What matters is what they actually stand for. The rights are just a contextual aspect of our reality. Like, do I want this person to not be able to say that? I want them to not say that. I want them to not, or not think that. I want them to not have that perspective. Stopping them from saying it isn't going to prevent them from thinking it, though, so it's not really a solution to the problem. The solution to the problem, I mean, there might not be any easy solution to the problem, but, still, we can hope, basically, that by exposing the idea, you can debunk it or something. But this is always the perspective, is it's like, you're never, as a complexitist, you're never on board with the shitty things people do, so long as they're within their rights. You're never on board with that. You're only agreeing to it as a temporary measure because, as a strategy, it doesn't make sense to try and take that away from people. Right? Now, presumably, if I had like a brainwashing device or some type of machine or some magic button where I could press and all the stupid ideas in the world just go away, yeah, of course I'd press that. I'd be a moral monster not to press that. You'd be a horrible person. If someone has a horrible set of ideas and you could just fix it like that, what kind of person would you be not to do that? It doesn't make any sense. But, of course, given that that's not an option, given that there is no easy fix to it, silencing it isn't a fix either. And silencing it tends to make it worse. And it tends to just create reactionaries and reactionary movements that don't really create anything useful and stuff like that. Honestly, a lot of this stuff, this bad stuff that people do with their rights is subject to some sort of transient, vanishing. It's something that would disappear after a certain amount of time, hopefully. It's not something that's necessarily, gonna go. It's definitely not something that would go away if you try to ban people like that. So, like, people like Milo Yiannopoulos being banned from Twitter. I don't like Milo Yiannopoulos. I think everything he says and believes is wrong. However, there's just no point in banning him. That's sort of the perspective, right? This is like, and this is just like, this is the weird thing, is that people always think that these these aspects of their common experience, like their rights and their blah and their blah, that is where ethics is located. It's located within your common experience. And it's not. Ethics is not located within your common experience. It's located very, very far from your common experience. Or it's hidden underneath. It's not something that's obvious. You have to really look for it and think about it and try to analyze the subtle patterns to try and really gauge what's actually ethically, morally right and wrong, right? These things, my attitude towards people like Milo is like, it's not like, there's no point in doing something like that. There's no point in banning a person like that. It just doesn't do anything, right? It's not an ethical position. It's a strategy position, right? And that makes a sort of a big difference between the complexitist, the sort of authoritarian complexitism or whatever, and libertarians or not, who actually think that rights are somehow inherently virtuous, and they're not. Well, within complexitism, rights are just a means to an end, because basically, the goal of complexitism is, within this absolute moral reference frame, is to maximize complexity. And so long as we can assure ourselves that a person within their rights are already doing that, then we don't have to worry. But if a person within their rights are not maximizing their complexity, then we do still need to worry. Right? We don't necessarily need to be against their rights, but we do need to worry. We do need to have moral concern because complexity is not being maximized. When complexity is being maximized, when we're sure of that, then you can have whatever rights you want, so long as that condition is met. And it needs to be, like, intrinsically met. It can't just be, like, we need to assure ourselves to a sufficient sense of, like, certainty that these conditions are in fact met. Then you can have your rights. So it's kind of like, everything has this, like, collectivist approach, and individualism just picks up whatever's left. You know, that's how the complexitist model applies. And of course, the idea behind it is that in this absolute moral reference frame, you have this absolute moral function, and the absolute moral function tells us exactly what is good, you know, for all of society, for all of reality, actually, for all of reality, and then that includes what is best for all of society, you know, human society, what's best for all humans, and that, you know, entails what is best for every individual within that society, and what each of them should individually do, you know, what is in each and every one of their best interests within this absolute moral reference frame. So, you know, the idea is that, like, self-interest and social interest are identical because self-interest can only ever accurately be measured within this absolute reference frame, and the absolute reference frame would ensure that the self-interest of any individual is something that coincides with whatever is the social interest of all of society, which has to coincide with whatever is in the absolute interest of all of reality. So, you know, that's how the framework works. I mean, I'm just explaining how it works in brief. Rights aren't part of that. The only way to justify rights, then again, the absolute setting for rights is that rights are good, assuming that a person within their rights is already doing everything right. You know, that there's no way that they could hurt anyone, or like there's no question of moral value if a person is within their rights. Because either it just doesn't matter, it's nihilism or whatever, or it doesn't matter because we know that the person is already doing something that's morally good, so they're already going to be maximizing some type of moral value function. And I mean, again, it's like obviously that isn't true in most cases. For libertarianism, one of the reasons I rail against it, this is their absolute moral reference frame. Their absolute moral reference frame simply says that if you have certain rights, anything a person does within those rights will always maximize some type of moral value. And that's the best way that things could possibly work. And I'm saying that's clearly nonsense. You can just look around and you see people acting within their rights that have completely insane opinions and ideas and views, and then clearly those things are morally objectionable and are subject to change. You know, so I'm not on board with people like Milo. I'm not on board with people, you know, using their rights to murder cats or something, you know, assuming animal rights don't exist, I suppose, you know, or using their rights to be an asshole. It doesn't, morality doesn't end there, because there's clearly, again, based on the absolute setting of Complexitism, which says that we have to have that the thing we're trying to maximize is complexity, I can easily look around reality right now, look at the empirical record, and see, look, there's clearly situations where people who act within their rights but don't contribute to maximizing moral value according to this absolute moral value reference frame. And that is what, you know, so ethically there's more, so ethically there's this Complexitism still has this greater, like, push towards, how do you say, assigning moral value to what people do, even if they're within their rights or not. And the point at which you stop assigning moral value to something people do is when you've assured yourself that they're already doing something that's good. And I suppose that the reason that libertarians aren't doing that, or they're not going further with it like the Complexitist is, or like I am, or like many leftists are, is because for some reason the insane idea that already with just these very simple bare bones system of rights, you know, and the non-aggression principle or whatever, we already have everything that you need to maximize moral value, which is nonsense. And I know they're not even thinking like that, because they're not even thinking like this. They're really just using all of that as an excuse to do what they want, which again is not even the real kind of, like, isn't even real self-interest. I'd say it's just fake, stupid self-interest. Again, because within Complexitism, self-interest, to be accurately weighed, is something that has to be weighed within a system where individuals are interacting. So your self-interest, maximizing your self-interest necessarily would entail maximizing social interest, within this interactive system. But of course they don't think that way, because they, again, the type of like self-interest that motivates them is this type of like, not just ignorant, but it's like irrational ignorance on the basis of like, once you have this like really stupid and simple legal, you know, legal option to do whatever, everything you do is automatically good. That's the moral perspective there, and there's just there's that's not enough. I'm saying there's more. There's clearly more structure to it, and that's pretty much how the complexitist sees things. However, in practice, I mean, unless you're some type of, you have a lot of evidence on your side, I don't see any reason why like people who get banned or people who have this and that, why any of that needs to happen. Why any of these like assholes or people who have horrible, terrible ideas I would never fucking agree to, that just shouldn't exist, people who shouldn't exist, people I would delete in a flash if it was that simple. But there is no purpose within the given world to actively seek them out and try and crush them, because it just doesn't seem to, it's not actually crushing the idea, it's just crushing, you know, their well-being, which is like superficial and petty. And that's pretty much the perspective on rights. So, in summary, rights exist, but they're not like it's not an objective concept, really. It's not, they are not some sort of culture-independent concept. They are not, they're very much culture-dependent. They're very much ambiguous. They're very much, you know, different people will talk about the same rights and have totally different ideas of when rights end and when they start. You know, there's nothing objective about them. However, within a very loose legal sense, yes, the complexitist believes in them as a strategy, as preserving rights as some kind of strategy that could help us expose bad ideas and ultimately crush the bad ideas in some other way, and perhaps maximize moral value, maximize complexity. That's always the goal. So yeah, there's no call to action because people are being assholes in terms of like rights violation, because they're just not doing enough that you have to actively like, you know, punch them and take their rights away. That's pretty much the perspective. I have to say, it's more complicated how it applies, because yes, there are obvious examples where it's like maybe you should go a bit further and actually, you know, if it's a privately owned whatever, you know, tell the person to ban them or stop them or give them a warning or some type of, you know, measure to be taken against them, you know, that may be rights violating. But it depends. It's very contextual, is what I'm saying. There's no silver bullet. The point is, though, ethically, just in terms of ethics, because that's all I really do here is I talk about ethics. Ethically, there is nothing inherently good about rights. They are our strategy. They are not an ethical, moral end in and of themselves. And that's all there is to really say. Cheers.